Well, to an occultist, because I was born on the Feast of Nemeralia, the day Bohemian Grove was dedicated, that was an important thing. Satan invested a lot of time in me. When I became an adult and entered the mystery schools, it all became very clear to me. My mother was diabolically possessed. And as she opened the door and I followed in behind her, I almost went to my knees. The walls from floor to ceiling were covered in blood. And Mary is my patron saint. And she came to me 3 times, but I didn't recognize her. I recognize her now very clearly.
By the way, my name is Joe McClane. I host a radio program called A Catholic Take, where we look at the world through a Catholic lens. I'd love for you to hang out with us. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below.
Hey, praise be to God. I was sent this book by Eira Wulfnothsson, The Devil's Mistake from Occultist to Christian. And I got to say, I really enjoyed diving into her background in the occult, raised as a child in the occult. And there were several points along the way, I got to say, that I also could relate to her story. And it was especially beautiful to see how Our Lady, no matter what darkness surrounded her, was there to help her, to bring her home into the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And she joins us now.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
I appreciate it. I really want to dive into your story now. So we're limited on time on the radio side. We do stay on the after show. We can extend, but give us the background. You were raised in the occult. Why were your parents? Why was your family involved in the occult when you were born and being raised as a little girl?
Well, it's an interesting story, and it's very unusual for the time. I'm 65 years old. So this was a very long time ago. In those days, it was very secretive. You put on the veneer of being ordinary. We're talking 1960s, 1970s. And my family, my mother's side, no one in my family's generations had been Christian for generations. No one went to church. There were no sacramentals in our home, no Bible, no crucifix. No one spoke of God. I didn't know who Mary was. Wow. It was absolutely ordinary to me. My life was very isolated growing up as a child. As you know, the Luciferian concepts are very different from the Christian concepts. My mother is very distant. There were many things happening in the house of a supernatural nature, but it was very clear to me growing up of what I would become. And that would be someone who attended the mystery schools. And the mystery schools back then were quite different than what you see on the internet today. Yeah. Back then, they were very secretive. They were usually a group of elderly people, mostly elderly men. But I was born on the Assumption of Mary, but I was always told I was born on the Feast of Nemeralia, which is the same day the Bohemian Grove was dedicated. And I was taken to the Bohemian Grove at age 3 by my mother. Yeah. So it was very clear to me and very ordinary to me. The education you receive after years of, the tradition or the way you would be raised in a Luciferian family, there is what you call grooming. As a child, you don't realize you're being groomed. It's more like fear, chaos, abuse, neglect. Even though my family had money and had a social position in the community, they were well known. Within the home, it was quite a different story. Back then, the orders and circles were extremely secretive, especially in the Bay Area. So the mystery schools were in the Bay Area. And of course, Bohemian Grove was the nearest, what you would call a temple for the orders and circles to gather in. Bohemian Grove isn't one specific order or circle. It's a gathering place for many. It commingles with the political crowd as well as the wealthy and powerful crowd. For example, in these places, in Bohemian Grove, the Manhattan Project was hatched there. So you have a coming together of Luciferians, which are known by many different names in many different orders and circles. And you have a group of the wealthy, powerful, and political. Presidents have been members, senators. They're all familiar faces too, and very famous.
In your book, you say about the Grove, you say the worship of Moloch, Baal, or any god or goddess can be performed at the Grove, and was done so often. Child sacrifice is required by Moloch, and indeed, that imagery is seen at the Grove within its rituals and performances. But the owl is a symbol of Satan, Lucifer, or one of his many faces to those in the know. It was once also the only symbol associated with the Illuminati. And you even go on to talk about how at the Grove, your mother took you to like a chamber. Was it underneath the owl?
No, it was behind. It's probably still standing. It's a building behind, as far as I remember. So I was very small, but I remember vividly as we drove in the winding, beautiful forest. There were tiny huts, tiny little cabins with different themes, very festive. To a child, it had twinkle lights, and one hut was a surfboard theme, another was a monk's theme. My mother took me to the lake. I was fascinated with the trees in the lake, and she would point out a tree that I've never seen photos of online. I've searched for it. The tree had a face carved into it, or it was a natural face. And she would tell me that men would go inside of this tree and speak through this tube to give the illusion that the god was speaking, but the gods really did speak, and that trees really do speak. This is at 3 years old. So my worldview was being formed, and I was at that time, that early age, being introduced. Now, when we came upon the building that's behind, or was behind, as far as my memory can reveal, there was a long hallway, and in the long hallway, I didn't recognize at 3 years old, but there were the capes and wands, pentacles, swords, athames, all of the instruments that you would use in ritual magic. I would come to find that out, of course, later in my life. And even so, in the back, there was a bag with the size of a small child. Even as a child, I would wonder who was in that bag. Was there someone in that bag?
I'm sure.
But it was a dummy that I was witnessing, because the Grove was empty. I was taken there and it was empty, except for one man who took my hand, took me down the aisle, and took me into a room that reminded me of the doctor's office. Back in the 60s and 70s, the doctor's office was very sterile. It was kind of like a pale gray, white, or a pale green. And in my adult mind, I remember that there was something that looked like a microwave. But we know back then they didn't have microwaves, but they did have autoclaves. And that's for sterilization of instruments. So I often wonder and speculate why I was brought there. Well, to an occultist, I have a very strange birth chart, in astrologically speaking. So that would be an important thing to a Luciferian or an occultist. And because I was born on the Feast of Nemeralia, the day Bohemian Grove was dedicated, that was an important thing. And because of my lineage, which went all the way back to Odin, here I am talking about myself, but these were important data points. And that explains to me why I was groomed in the fashion I was. There was a goal. Satan invested a lot of time in me. I was born to a woman who is manifesting at least 3 or 4 times a week. As a child, I didn't understand what that was. As I began to grow older, I realized this was a generational spirit, via osmosis and just hearing and listening. You begin to put the pieces together. When I became an adult and entered the mystery schools, it all became very clear to me. My mother was diabolically possessed, perhaps since before I was born.
Wow.
So I'm telling you these things because it doesn't matter if you believe it, they believe it. And this is how children are groomed. People always ask me, well, how did you ever get into the mystery schools? And how did you learn what you learned? And how do you know what you know? It's not that you're chosen per se. It's your family. It's so many things. It's complex. But nevertheless, here I am. The biggest blessing for me.
We're going to be at a break here in just about a minute and a half, 2 minutes now. And I want to get to how Our Lady came into your life in these times, in the midst of all of that crazy.
Yes.
You didn't know anything about it. So can you just maybe tease that before we go to break, and then we'll talk more about it on the other side?
Yes. Well, being born on the Feast of Numeralia, I never knew I was born on the Feast of the Assumption. Mary is my patron saint, and she came to me 3 times, but I didn't recognize her. I recognize her now very clearly. And so I can share that with you after the break.
Yeah, it's a great story, actually. I was reading about this in your book as well, and you talk about this as I lay there with tears filling my eyes, something astounding happened. A lady of pure white light appeared standing over me. She smelled like flowers, and she took all my fear away just with her motherly presence. That was, I think, the first experience you had of Our Lady, and that was in a house that the first time you walked into that room was the walls were covered in blood. Your mom bringing you in that room, and she painted over the walls and made you sleep in that house with your sister. And as a little girl, absolutely frightened. You know, it's just very interesting on a number of levels because one, we know inherently evil when we see it, and we can feel overwhelmed by the darkness. We can feel outnumbered and surrounded by that darkness, and yet through that, the innocence of a child, Our Lady still comes and still appears to you there. And I think that's very, very fascinating. Tell me more about that. So when you see this lady from light, you must intuitively know that there was a clear, stark contrast between the world that you were growing up in and all that you were experiencing in all of this, and then this woman. What were your initial thoughts of her?
I didn't recognize her as Mary. I mean, the visions that I've had or my experiences with Christ or Mary, I don't hear a voice. God doesn't just have a conversation with me. I was about 10 years old, 8 to 10 years old. And I was very isolated, as I said, meaning I had both physical abuse as well as emotional abuse. So I didn't have what you would consider a mother. I had a blood mother, but I really had no mother. She was constantly, not constantly, but at least 3 times a week manifesting the demon, or what I should say, the generational spirit, which is most likely a fallen angel. At 8 or 10 years old, I was taken to the bottom, to the far reaches of our estate, and there was a little old house that looked like the land was trying to reclaim it. It was covered in blackberries, very obscure, hidden in the underbrush, but it was a small little house. And I lived on an estate that was behind iron gates, so this house was very isolated. No one could get to it. And my mother took me down. She had her measuring stick in her hands and some paint swatches. It wasn't like a mother-daughter where you're laughing and talking or interacting. I was just with her, following her in. And as she opened the door and I followed in behind her, I almost went to my knees. The walls from floor to ceiling were covered in blood. Excuse me. They were smattered with blood from floor to ceiling.
That's horrible.
My mother just casually, My mother casually continued to measure for curtains, and she never told me what it was. She didn't react to what I was seeing or seem to care. A month or two later, my sister was returning from a finishing school in Switzerland. You can imagine why she was sent away. She was 10 years older than me. I barely knew her even. And she was pregnant, and this was to be the little house she would stay in. When my sister returned and moved into the house, I was told I was going to go down there and spend the night with her. I was going to be babysat by her. And I was afraid to go to this house, but yet I went in, and now the walls were covered in a cheerful yellow. There were curtains hanging. Well, my sister put me on the couch with a blanket and went to bed and closed her door. And I laid there in the darkness, and I could feel the evil that was still present in that house. One of the things about me at a very young age, it was clear that I could feel evil, and it's not a way of seeing, but it's very clear when evil is present. I guess you could say I see evil on others. I see evil in the world very clearly. I always thought everyone could, but I guess it was a survival mechanism in me. And I felt that evil keenly closing in on me. And I started to cry. And I lay there on that couch. And then very slowly, a light began to blossom standing over me. And it was a woman of light. She had beautiful robes on that were pure white light with lace and embroidery. And she smelled like flowers. I could see the light, a divine light emanating from her. Now, I describe this as an adult, but as a child, she was just the lady of light to me. She brought a comforting feeling, and it felt like the love of a mother. And it was almost instantly when she manifested, that evil left the room. It just disappeared.
Praise be to God.
This was the first. Amen.
We're only going to have about another 4 minutes left before we have to say goodbye to the radio. Can you just do me a favor? Then that is an amazing gift. I wish more people had these kinds of experiences. Unfortunately, we don't. So how do you get from occult to Catholic? Maybe you can just summarize that for us, and we can go into greater detail in the after show. But can you summarize how do you actually make that transition from this world of magic and darkness and Luciferianism and all of that to becoming Catholic?
Well, you have to understand I was a ceremonial magician. So I had a tremendous education equal to a university education in Hermetic philosophy, geomancy, necromancy, the trivium, the quadrivium, Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, alchemistic philosophy, oration, theurgy. My education was tremendous. And so I didn't exactly choose to become Christian. God flipped me like a switch in one incredible night at age 60. I am only a baby Christian. I'm only 5 years old. I'm a new creation in Christ. Makes me emotional. But God flipped me like a switch overnight. And I believe my life had reason for my dark background. My life had reason for the education I was given, for being born to a possessed mother. Because knowing evil and being able to share it on my podcast or in my book, its ways, its methodologies, I'm able to help other Christians inoculate against it and understand the reality of it, understand the metaphysical reality that we exist in. Science tells us everything is physical. It's metaphysical. And we learn this as occultists. What I've learned is occultism for me is my best defense of Christ, of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, because it gave me a foundation of understanding outside of mainstream science.
And the Rosary played a role in that.
The Rosary was key. And that's a story that's a little bit longer, so you might want to wait on that one. But I picked up a rosary. I had been given it 23 years earlier by a very drunk best friend's mother from childhood. And she pushed it into my chest and said, "Here, you need this." She was wearing a sarong and a Hawaiian lei and staggered down the hallway.
Hilarious.
Well, when she died 23 years later, I had carried around this rosary in the bottom of my jewelry box. It was broken for 23 years. And I took it out and I Googled how to pray the rosary for dummies.
Wow.
I prayed it one time. Remember, Mary was my patron saint that I knew nothing of.
Yeah.
She was
powerful.
at work.
Well, we're out of time on the radio side of things, but the book is called From Occultist to Christian, The Devil's Mistake, Eira Wulfnothsson.
Did you like that video? It's okay. You can admit it. It's perfectly fine. Hey, we cover the big stories of our day, from inside the church to outside the church to all points in between, and we do it from a Catholic perspective. It's called A Catholic Take. It's a radio program Monday through Friday. We live stream it right here on this channel, by the way, so make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We would be very grateful to you. And don't forget, you're going to want to watch this video right here because you don't want to miss anything.